What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Today's topic is going to be the edge rusher position, or more specifically, does Green Bay have enough depth at edge rusher to get through the season and to ultimately be successful? I think it's genuinely one of the more important questions as we head into training camp. I think we all sort of maybe expected that at some point Green Bay would pick up a veteran edge rusher. There's not much left on the market. We'll get to more on that in just a moment. But I think in order to understand this topic just a little bit better, we need to take a look back at 2021 and understand what Green Bay did at the edge rusher position during that season. If you go and turn on Madden 22 right now and play with last year's Green Bay Packers team, you feel pretty good about the edge rusher position. You get Preston Smith, Zadarius Smith, Rashawn Gary, Whitney Mercilus. That feels like it would be a heck of an edge rusher group. In all actuality, it didn't really go down that way, as we all know. Preston Smith and Rashawn Gary both played the vast majority of the snaps at edge rusher. Unfortunately, Zadarius Smith only played in 2 games for a total of 37 snaps. Whitney Mercilus played in 5 games for a total of 119 snaps. So their total contribution was basically less, well, right around almost the exact same as what Tipa Nalii played a season ago. So it was mostly Preston Gary and a bunch of, other players, which we'll talk about in a second here. And Whitney Mercilus and Zadarius Smith didn't play a ton. So let's look at how many snaps each of these edge rushers played, how they graded, and then we can kind of get into maybe some of the issues that we saw last season and why maybe Green Bay wants to correct it this season. So Preston Smith played 732 snaps. I had him with a plus 2.85 grade. Very nice grade. Rashawn Gary, 722 snaps with a plus 6.20 grade. Fantastic grade. Jonathan Garvin, 396 snaps, was the next on the list. He was their number 3 edge rusher for the majority of the season. Negative 6.15 grade, my lowest graded Packer from a season ago on either side of the ball. Tipa Nalii, 152 snaps with a negative 1.45 grade. As mentioned, Whitney Mercilus played 119 snaps, had a plus 0.05 grade, so basically neutral. Ladarius Hamilton played 64 snaps with a negative 0.05 grade, so basically neutral. Chauncey Rivers played 54 snaps, had a negative 1.35 grade, and Zadarius Smith 37 snaps with a negative 0.15 grade. So those were the snaps from a season ago. Preston and Rashawn getting the most, Garvin being the 3, Tipa being sort of the number 4. Mercilus was moved up to the number 3 while he was in for those handful of games, but immediately got injured. And then Hamilton, Rivers, and Z with a smattering of snaps here and there. One of my biggest issues, not just at edge rusher, but quite frankly on the defense and on the team overall a season ago, was that I thought they did a really poor job of rotating their edge rusher group, especially when Whitney Mercilus and Zadarius Smith weren't there. Far too often, in my opinion, what would happen is you'd have Preston and Gary, and they would be playing their snaps, and then Preston and Gary would go out at the same time, and all of a sudden in comes Garvin and Tipa, and you were just a shell of yourself on defense because, no offense to Garvin or Tipa, but the fall off from both Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith to Jonathan Garvin and Tipa Nalii was significant. And I would have liked to have seen much more mixing and matching so that you at least have one of Garvin or Preston on the field at all times as much as possible and don't end up in a situation where you have 2 edge rushers who both are struggling to set the edge, who both are struggling to get any pressure. That just leaves you a lot more vulnerable. So regardless of edge depth or anything like that, I would like to see Green Bay use those rotations a little bit better than they did a season ago. So when we look at the snaps from last year, though, we can kind of get an understanding of just where Green Bay needs to fill in the gaps. So Preston and Gary averaged about 40 snaps a game. If you look in general, usually a defensive snap count for any given game is going to be around 65 snaps. So that leaves about 25 snaps at both positions, 50 snaps total per game that Green Bay needs to fill in with edge rushers that are not named Rashawn Gary or Preston Smith. And you might be thinking, okay, but Andy, let's look at it this way, right? Green Bay was a 13-win team a season ago in the playoffs. They played fantastic against the 49ers. And could it be much worse? Because you just mentioned they didn't really have Merciless or Za'Darius a season ago. They had Garvin and Tipa taking the majority of the snaps. And now you brought in a Kingsley and Igbare in the 5th round. You get Randy Ramsey back. You still have Tipa. You still have Garvin. You still have Hamilton. Is it really going to be much worse? And I can understand the thought process there. However, what I would say is sort of the game that we're going off of that makes us kind of believe that the Packers could be a tremendous defense this upcoming season is that 49ers game in the playoff, right? They were phenomenal in that game. And guess what? They had both Whitney Merciless and Za'Darius Smith in that game, taking those snaps away from Jonathan Garvin and Tipa Galeai. And I think that was, quite frankly, a decent reason why Green Bay was so successful on defense in that game. They didn't have all of a sudden 2 edge rushers coming who were just a immediate downgrade when Rashawn and Preston went out of the game. So I would like to see that improved a little bit. I do think Ramsey being back and Igbare coming in could be of assistance. I think both of those players could be better than Garvin or Tipa from a season ago, but how much better remains to be seen. So the other thing that I want to get into here is ultimately, if we're talking about a healthy Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith, I think there's ways around it. That's gonna be the main point of the discussion in just a second here. But I think if you were to say right now that Rashawn Gary or Preston Smith miss any significant period of time, I think there would be some legitimate worry. And I get all the time, right? Like people will, when I comment on the current state of the depth with the Packers, people will say, well, Andy, nobody has 3 great edge rushers, or, nobody has 3 great safeties, or nobody's going to have a really good 4th corner. And to some extent, I understand that no team is built perfectly, and there's going to be spots and areas of depth where you have some concerns, right? But where my concern lies with the depth on this team, and as I've mentioned before, it's that when you get to some of these spots, specifically like the number 3 edge rusher, number 3 safety, number 4 corner to a lesser extent, but you have like completely unproven players at these spots. So it's not like, of course you're going to get worse, right? If your number 1 guy goes down and you have to fill him in with a number 3 or a number 4 somewhere, you're going to get worse, right? But this is going potentially from like Rashawn Gary playing 50 snaps a game to now like Randy Ramsey or Kingsley and Igbare playing 50 snaps a game. That is a massive degradation. Same thing if Preston goes out and Ramsey or Igbare or Garvin or Tipa or any of those guys are in. So I do still think that Green Bay could use a depth signing. The issue, as mentioned earlier, is there's just not much left on the free agent market. Justin Houston was basically kind of the last good player that was out there, at least as a stand-up edge rusher, and he's gone. You could go with like a Ryan Kerrigan, but he's played a ton of snaps in his career. Tack McKinley, who's sort of been up and down. Jeremiah Atachu. All of those guys would have to come in and just fight for their roster spot, quite frankly. I would still like to see it, any of those guys, just as a veteran depth piece that can compete with some of the players that are currently on this roster. Whether or not they make the team, they would have to earn that, but I would still like to see them come in and compete and potentially be that veteran off the bench, because I do think there's something there. But I do think there are some answers to this question. Not the question if Preston or Gary go down for a strong period of time, because that is still a concern for me. But I do think as we are looking at filling in those 50 snaps per game, right? I do think there's another option here. And the answer might be Dean Lowry and Quay Walker. And you might be thinking, okay, Dean Lowry is a 3-4 defensive end, and Quay Walker is a off-ball linebacker. How are they going to fill in at, for edge rusher as like a stand-up outside linebacker? Well, I'm not necessarily asking them to do that. I do think Quay could do that in some capacity. I do think he could be utilized as a outside edge rusher in some situations. I don't think it behooves Quay Walker, and I don't think it behooves Green Bay to play Quay Walker as a legit, 25 snap a game edge rusher as a number 3 or 4 edge rusher. I don't think that does anybody any favors, quite frankly. I don't think that's what his specialty is going to be. But I do think that there is a legit answer to this by running a 3-3-5 defense, which could be really fun and bring a lot of different wrinkles to the table. And I've discussed this a little bit in the past, but I wanted to go over it a little bit more in detail today. So imagine this, right? Imagine for 15 snaps per game, which helps cover the 25 that you need. you've got 15 snaps where you play 3-3-5, and then maybe there's 10 other snaps that you give. You give 10 to Inigbari, you give 10 to Ramsey. You rotate things around a little bit better. That, I think, is a good use of your personnel, right? You use Gary and Preston a ton. You use about 15 snaps of 3-3-5, and you use about 10 snaps of Ramsey, 10 snaps of Inigbari. That, to me, is a formula that very much could work, especially if you use them in the right places at the right times. But what does a 3-3-5 look like? So I think there's two different 3-3-5 sort of formations that Green Bay can go with. The first one is more of a base sort of, all right, they could run, they could pass, but we need to at least be prepared that they could run the football. That's sort of what I would call a base 3-3-5 defense. In that situation, you've got Kenny Clark as like basically one defensive end in a three-man front, TJ Slayton as your true nose tackle, and Dean Lowry as the other defensive end. And then you've got Quay Walker, Devondre Campbell, and Chris Barnes as your off-ball linebackers. So 3 down linemen, 3 off-ball linebackers, and then of course your base nickel defense, which is going to be Rasul, Jair, Stokes, Savage, and Amos. So that would be your 3-3-5 sort of base defense. And with that, you could also bring in Amos or a Savage down in the box, especially if it's more of a run personnel, to give you even a better run stopping look. But in that situation, you could just play it as a straight 3-3-5, right? TJ Slayton's your pure nose. Kenny Clark and Lowry both have some pass rush prowess as inside defensive linemen, or in this case, like more of like a defensive end sort of defensive lineman. And then you've got Quay Campbell Barnes. You could bring Campbell off of one edge. You could bring Quay off of the other edge. You could bring a corner off the edge. There's a lot of different things that you could do in that scenario. You could just play it straight up as a 3-3-5. And I think that defense has some flexibility, and there's a lot of fun things that you could do with that. And I think it would be satisfactory in stopping the run. Not a ton of pass rush on the field. You're, sort of relegated to probably Quay Clark, and probably Lowry in that situation. But I like it a lot better than, like, what's the alternative, right? You're going, if we look back at last year, it was a lot of maybe Kenny Clark and Dean Lowry on the inside with now, Tipa and Garvin on the outside. That group wasn't good enough. And then you had Barnes and Campbell in the middle. To me, that group just wasn't good enough. This, I have 6 guys in my front in Clark, Slayton, Lowry, Barnes, Campbell, and Quay that I all trust, that I think are going to make the right play, that I think are going to do the right thing, that have good athleticism, that can do everything that you want them to do. You don't have 2 guys in Tipa and Garvin who were grading well into the negative on the field. You have guys that are all basically grading in the positive. And that, I think, is a real benefit for Green Bay running this style of defense. So that would be sort of your base 3-3-5 defense. But I also think you have a lighter 3-3-5. And what I want to talk about here is more of this option where you have Devontae Wyatt at one end, Kenny Clark as your nose tackle in this situation, Dean Lowry as your other defensive end, and then Quay Campbell and Barnes, and then still your same nickel defense behind it. In that situation, what basically happens is you could play that straight up as a 3-3-5 as well. And again, you could bring Quay off the edge if you want. You could bring, blitz your corner. You could do so many different things. Or you could just drop 8 into coverage and rush Wyatt and Clark and Lowry in that situation. You could do that. That's a legitimate option that you could run with. But all of a sudden, you line up in that 3-3-5 defense. And now right before the snap, you hedge over and Lowry moves over, Clark moves over, Wyatt moves over, and Quay moves to your edge rusher. And now what you basically have is Quay on the edge is like a stand-up outside linebacker, which is he can legitimately do from time to time. Then you've got Wyatt and Clark on the inside, 2 legitimate pass rushing defensive tackles coming from the inside. And now you've got Dean Lowry that's basically sort of lined up as a 4-3 defensive end. He could stand up if you really wanted him to, but I would just keep his hand in the dirt and play him as an outside defensive end, move him outside a little bit more, and give him a running start, let him use his physicality. I think that's a real legitimate option where now all of a sudden you've got Quay and Lowry coming off the edge. You've got Clark and Wyatt on the inside. And guess what? You still have Campbell and Barnes as your off-ball linebackers, which is what it was basically all last season. And then you've got your 3 corners and your 2 safeties. I really like that option. And again, much better than I like the options that Green Bay had last year, even more than an Inigbari into Randy Ramsey, Garvin, Tipa, whoever you want to go with. I just think this is a much stronger lineup for Green Bay. So what I would like to see is play your 40-45 snaps of Preston and Gary, play your 10-ish snaps of Inigbari or Ramsey or Garvin or Tipa, whoever you want in those snaps. but play that 10 to 15 snaps at 3-3-5. And guess what? If it works really well, then do more of it. Because I think there is some real upside to playing that style of defense. And I think it could get very confusing for opposing offenses, especially as a change of pace. You're playing a lot of two outside linebackers standing up, and you're playing a lot of your base nickel defense and those sort of things. All of a sudden you switch it up with a 3-3-5, and sort of the responsibilities and the rules start to change, and the offense has to kind of change up on the fly. And I think Green Bay has the personnel to run a true nickel defense with two outside linebackers standing up in Gary and Preston. But I think they have some really fun personnel to run a legit 3-3-5 as well, both in a base situation and in obvious passing situations. And again, I like the changeup, and I think it could cause confusion for opposing offense. So long story short here, as we look at the edge group and the depth or the lack thereof, I still have major concern if Preston or Gary were to go down for any significant period of time. And maybe Brian Gutekunst still has an ace up his sleeve. We saw Devondre Campbell signed a season ago. We saw, in season Rasul Douglas. Listen, if he's got a Rasul Douglas sort of signing in his pocket, if he could make it at edge rusher this year, that would be great. We saw him sign Whitney Merciless midway through the season, which looked like it was going to be an awesome signing until he unfortunately got hurt. So we've seen Brian Gutekunst find players and make moves before. It wouldn't shock me if he found an edge rusher that could still be a very valuable member to this group, even if it's midway through the season. But as of right now, until that happens, or if that doesn't happen, would love to see a bit more flexibility, maybe running with some 3-3-5, and maybe letting Quay Walker and Dean Lowry actually do a bit more of the heavy lifting at sort of an edge rusher type position. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all new episode. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.